Hello and welcome to Spectrum. In this episode, we will be looking at gender stereotypes in the workplace, with interviews from activists, academics and students. Some think that stereotypes still exist. Others think that the problems are exaggerated.
All right, so another issue in regard to gender and wages or education differences is this whole issue about the wage differential between women and men. So we've all heard about this, that the woman makes 70 cents to every dollar. And before I was more sort of sympathetic to feminist views, I really did not like this statistic because it's very clear when you look at the statistics and really read about it in a systematic manner that this is very misleading, and the statistics they sort of give a overall picture that really skews what reality is like in a lot of ways. So when we hear that statistic, what we think is, okay, so me as a woman, I go into my job as a journalist, and Bob over here goes in for the job. We're both offered the job, but our boss says, okay, well, Christina's a woman, so she's going to get 70 cents per hour, and he's going to get $1 per hour. And in reality, this isn't what happens. The bigger issue that does need to be dealt with in regard to why women are making less than men is the fact that there's not enough part-time professional positions. So we see that this wage differential tends to happen as women are going into their 30s. Now, obviously, this is the time when a lot of women would-be contenders for six-figure jobs are having kids, and they want to spend more time with the kids, they want to take time off of work, and the fact is that there is just not enough part-time positions for women who are qualified to do professional jobs.
But does sexism manifest itself in more subtle ways?
I think since coming to university, I found it a lot easier to fit in with a group of people that share my general approach towards life, which is not to define myself by hypermasculinity. I have started wearing makeup. I care a lot more about fashion. I'm willing to talk about and able to talk about some non-typically masculine passions like musical theatre. And I feel that because university is a large space, I've been able to find a larger community within which that kind of thing is acceptable. I also think that because university contains a lot of different types of people, it leads to more tolerance of people who are different from yourself. In terms of my experience in the workplace, I recently took part in a module at university wherein I went to primary school to help out as a sort of teaching assistant. And I found that when I was going there, I purposefully chose not to wear makeup because I was sort of self-censoring myself into this idea of men don't wear makeup, and I felt that it would have been an issue had I chosen to wear makeup. Now, I don't know if it would have been, and probably in the 21st century no one would really have mentioned it or minded, but I sort of self-censored. And I don't regret that decision because I think that there are spaces where it is not as easy to be a non-masculine male, and I think that you have to be aware of those situations, and it's not necessarily a sign of accepting that as acceptable when you attempt to fit into that field. But I did find myself sort of taking a step back from the acceptance that I have come to appreciate in terms of my own ability to define myself on my own terms and not on those socially prescribed terms of gender.
My first interview is with Merrick and Claire, who are social justice and environmental activists. Can you both introduce yourselves, please, and tell me what you do?
My name is Merrick Badger. I'm a campaigner with Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance.
I'm Claire Fawcett, and I'm currently working as a freelance journalist, researcher and trainer.
Fantastic. What's been your past experience in terms of employment?
I've been working at Footprint Workers Cooperative, which is a workers cooperative printing company based in Leeds that works mainly with people who are doing campaigns or artists or people producing their own comics and booklets, and was a really great place to work for quite a long time because it was us taking control of our own labour conditions, running our own company, not for profit, and trying to be as ecologically minded as possible.
Fantastic.
I've been involved in a large range of environmental and social justice campaigns, involved in the tree protests in the 1990s, Newbury Bypass, places like that. A range of anti-capitalist stuff, campaigning against the World Bank, the IMF, more recently climate change activism, and then being involved in environmental and social justice campaigning got me spied on by undercover police officers. We caught one of them, called Mark Kennedy, and since we caught Mark, we've been helping expose other officers and put together the story of what undercover police officers have been doing to political campaigners for the last 40-50 years. In the meantime, this has been paid for by a variety of things. I've worked on a vegetable farm, I've worked in a mortgage department of a major international bank, and now I've ended up working at Footprint Workers Cooperative in Leeds, which is great because we have no boss, so it means that you have all the workers' meetings and all the employers' meetings. It's a lot more meetings to take control and run things as a cooperative, but then this is your politics in action. Nobody has power over anybody.
So within Footprint, do you think things are fairly equal? You've not experienced any discrimination with gender, which perhaps would occur in other places, but is it a lot more equal?
There have been times when we've deliberately hired women because we wanted to keep a good gender balance within the organisation. And I'd say that the kind of power that there is within the organisation is based on experience and length of tenure. You can kind of get founder syndrome a bit with cooperatives, where there's one person who kind of set it up, other people have come in, and they have a lot of power because they know how things have always been and why decisions have been made in a certain way in the past. But I think that's the kind of power dynamics that there are within the organisation, trying to make sure that it's equal for everybody rather than just having one person who thinks that they know how everything's done. And I think we've negotiated that relatively well.
So would you call that positive discrimination, or would you just say that is employing people on an equal basis?
There's definitely been positive discrimination in favour of women applicants. Again, just keeping the gender balance in the company, that has happened. And so
it's been in situations where there've been really good candidates from both genders. We needed to base the decision on, you kind of end up going to things like the gender balance in order to make the decision. So in an industry like printing, it's really rare for there to be a lot of women working in operating machinery. It's quite surprising how I say to people that I work for a printing company, and then they say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I say, "Printing," because they assume that if I work for a printing company, I do admin.
And in past jobs that you've had, have you experienced any form of gender discrimination or sexism in the workplace?
I've been working in workers' cooperatives where we have control of our own conditions of labour for maybe 15 years now. And so in those organisations I really didn't experience, and they were often quite women-led organisations, where we were able to be very flexible with one, without very much money, because we didn't make very much money, but we were able to control the conditions of our labour. Before that, working in NGOs, I felt that there was a real lack of flexibility for women, and I see that in seeing other NGOs at work through people I know. I know a lot of people that work in NGOs, and feel that there's often a lack of flexibility for women who have different needs to men in a lot of cases, particularly bringing up children and needing to have quite flexible working conditions. And I feel like, because it's more expensive a lot of the time for an organisation to really meet the needs of its workers, there's often a lack of effort put in to try and allow jobs to be shared and to have more flexible working conditions. I don't know how that compares to the private sector, because I don't know very much about the private sector, but I feel like there's a lot more effort that NGOs could make to make sure that the working conditions are appropriate for different sectors of society. Although there's a lot of women very highly represented in NGOs, the bosses are usually men, and the number of organisations that are basically run by ageing white men, it kind of really defines the politics of organisations that are trying to create social change. And I think that having more diverse management in those organisations and a less hierarchical management structure in those organisations would create a really different idea of what social change can be achieved.
Fantastic. Is such sexism just experienced in this country? To look further afield, I spoke to Emily, a student at St Andrews, about her experience of working abroad.
I spent a summer working in quite a Christian country that has the image of being a lot more conservative than perhaps the UK is, and I was working in a very rural community, and I was quite concerned from kind of the image I'd grown up with of a whole community centred around a church, that the values would be very restricting towards women and quite dismissive of women. But I found that when I got there, even though I'd been concerned about not being able to be involved in the project or not being listened to because I was female, actually they were much more grateful that I'd come with a local NGO who was really invested in helping them and sharing knowledge with them, that actually they didn't care how young I was, they didn't care that I was female, they didn't care that I was foreign. There was absolutely no moment in the whole 10 weeks where I felt like I was being dismissed, which was really surprising for me because it completely challenged the kind of idea that I'd had of that kind of community. In terms of gender stereotypes within their community as a whole, I feel like we have a really big tendency in developed countries, especially like places like the UK, that we have a tendency to turn gender stereotyping into quite an aggressive discourse, and we're constantly looking for some kind of fight to pick. But because there was no sort of recognition of women being able to become mechanics or physicists or do anything really other than become a midwife or a mother, there was no pressure on women to try and prove themselves. So I felt like my host sisters and my host mother and the other young women in the community were so much less stressed and concerned about their futures than I felt, because they hadn't ever grown up with the idea of a choice, which is also a bad thing because there was no discourse around them having a better education or having sort of a professional career or leaving their community. But also in terms of their individual lives, they were a lot more content with themselves and a lot happier than I think a lot of women my age in this country feel.
Returning closer to home, I interviewed Dr. Carol Gentry, who lectures in terrorism and gender. So, first of all, can you just introduce yourself? Tell me a little bit about what you do.
Okay, I'm Karen Gentry. I'm a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in the School of International Relations, and I work on gender and terrorism.
Fantastic. And how would you define gender?
Right. Gender is a social construction of how we perceive masculinity and femininity.
Okay, and do you think that those gender stereotypes can affect the way we interact with people? How do you think it shapes our behaviour?
Absolutely. I think it does impact how we interact with people, and I think it's one of the first things we notice about a person. I think it then determines the credibility we give them, the legitimacy we give them. It determines whether or not we're going to trust them, whether or not we're going to fear them. So I think it's one of the main factors in how we approach people.
So what are some of the ways that we stereotype men and women differently?
Well, okay, so men, I think, are automatically presumed to have political, business, public credibility, that they get to be agents in the world and are seen as rational and logical, and they get to be assertive. And then with women, we see them, we diminish this credibility and legitimacy in the public world. We see their actions as perhaps less rational and less logic. In fact, I'm not even sure that I really like the word rational, because I see that as a very gendered word. Instead, I think there are other ways of approaching what we're trying to weigh in people and how they make their decisions. I think reason is a much more appropriate word. But so some of the gender stereotypes that would exist, so that male politicians are automatically seen to have kind of this credibility and this power, whereas women have to kind of fight to assert it. That I had a friend in 2008 when Hillary Clinton was in the presidential primaries against Barack Obama, that called and asked, given that Hillary Clinton must surely be in menopause or approaching menopause, could we trust that she'd be a rational politician? So that is one way that stereotypes influence.
Okay, and in terms of a school environment, very early on, how do you think the gender stereotypes manifest themselves? How are boys and girls kind of characterized?
I think it's another political example, but so apparently at Christmas time, President Obama was helping sort toys for a toy giveaway, and there were bins labeled boys and girls, and then just this pile of toys. And so he was sorting them, And he made a point of putting like a basketball in the girl bin, a baseball bat and ball in the girl bin, Legos in the girl bin. And at one point, a reporter said, Legos aren't for girls. And I was so stunned that, like, it came out over Legos. Why not over, the basketball or something? I mean, it was, so the gendering, it wasn't, they maybe perhaps knew to keep their mouth shut at the gendering of sports, but somehow felt it was more acceptable to gender building blocks. And that in both the US and UK, there's a problem with really training girls to know that they can succeed in maths and sciences. And I think equally we're not pursuing the needs of boys as far as this gets into science, and I feel like it gets a little more tricky with gendered conversations, and it's hard to do it in a soundbite. But there seems to be evidence suggests that both boys and girls need activity to learn, need physical activity to learn, but that boys need a bit more activity, but also more kind of a dynamic learning environment. And so then we're also now gendering boys to be left behind a bit. So I'm not an expert on primary school education, but we have our gendered expectations that boys will be a natural fit for sciences and girls a natural fit for the humanities is a problematic notion. Instead, what I would say is that we, both boys and girls, men and women, whatever those sexed categories may be, because that's more complicated than XX and XY chromosomes, we need to recognize that people have different talents and different intelligences, and then be teaching to those different talents and intelligences, not based off of gendered expectations, not based off of race expectations, but based off of how they are testing and where they show their ability to lie, and working with that.
Do you think between the school environment and then moving to university there is a difference in gendered expectations? Does it remain the same? How do stereotypes come into play?
I think it depends on the school environment and the university environment. I think some schools deal with it better, and I think some universities deal with it better. But I definitely think there are still gendered expectations upon coming to university. I think that we tend to gender men to be more vocal and outspoken, and to be more assertive and opinion giving, and to be in class participation. And we've gendered women to be quieter and more passive in class participation. And then when that becomes transgressed, it becomes a problem. I think in St. Andrews we have social gendered expectations of what it means to be a man and a woman here that are problematic. I think I've observed, and it could be from where I was before, but there's quite a bit of sexualization that seems to happen here, and I don't think it's just St. Andrews. From what I'm reading in newspapers, is that it's happening everywhere. So I guess it was at Glasgow where girls got a text from a club that said they had an STD. I think it was either in Glasgow or perhaps Newcastle, where clubs were using sexual violence as advertisement. So these ads that look like kind of a post-rape scene. So that's just problematic. It's deeply problematic. And so I think that students are navigating both a social and an academic gendered expectation that's probably quite difficult at times.
Do you think specifically within international relations, is it harder for women in any way or for men?
I think it's strange. IR as a field is gendered. There is no doubt. So let me break it, maybe answer your question backwards by taking it from the top and going down. One, there are fewer women in international relations as scholars. Two, women tend to leave early. We have a pipeline leak where, because they've kind of hit a block, women tend to leave academia for policy jobs or nonprofit jobs, but they're not in academia anymore. So they're not teaching and we're not reading their scholarship. And part of that block is coming from the fact that we have gendered our subject. So we have hard security issues like strategy and security and defense and missile systems that men are more prone to going into for whatever reason. That could be because they're finding mentors there. It could be because they like the scholarship more. It could be for a variety of factors. Women tend to be going into kind of soft security issues, human rights, development, economics, gender, feminism, God forbid. And so then the publication track is different. We're publishing in different journals, but the priority in international relations is still the security and strategy journals. They're ranked higher. So then when we're looking at jobs and who's going to get a job, people who have the higher ranked journal articles are going to be getting the jobs and be getting the attention more than the people who are publishing in the softer areas. So then we don't see them as worthy of promotion, and we don't see them as worthy of being professors. So they're being blocked. So women get frustrated and leave. So this is a gender dynamic we need to recognize, and there needs to be an epistemic shift. This is an epistemic problem. And then that relates into the courses that we're teaching. At St. Andrews, I actually think the student population is more heavily weighted towards women. I think we have more women. But I wouldn't say that is representative of the field overall.
So do you think within the workplace more broadly, there are gendered expectations and differences?
Absolutely. Well, the Guardian article last week I thought was great. We tend not to invite women to conferences. We tend not to listen to their papers. We tend to patronize them. We don't tend to give them questions, which means we're not prioritizing their work as much as we do men's. I think academia has been gendered since always. It started as a male bastion and has remained a male bastion, and we're not quite sure what it means to dismantle that and how that looks. And I think we can institute as much as possible structural policies to try to overcome this, but it doesn't necessarily shift values. And until the values of the people within the academic staff, but also within the administrative staff changes, we're going to continue to see dynamics that are problematic.
Do you think that gender stereotypes have impacted you personally in any way?
I think I've often been seen as a teacher more than a researcher. And I think that has to do with being a woman.
And then this is a broader question, but do you think these gender stereotypes can impact people's mental health?
Yeah, I think it's frustrating. And I think frustration leads to anger, and anger is linked conclusively to depression. I think that frustration leads to lack of job satisfaction. Lack of job satisfaction is linked to depression. So, I think we're really, that is just kind of an instrumental view of it. But I think if we're not taking people seriously, and if we're not really hearing what they have to say, because epistemically we can't hear them, so that would be what Miranda Fricker, who's a philosopher, would call it's epistemic injustice, and she breaks that down in her book, Epistemic Injustice. But that's a real, you're no longer seen, you no longer feel credible, right? And so even if that doesn't lead to depression, it certainly leads to serious self-doubt. And I think self-doubt can lead to self-harm. And that doesn't have to be a physical self-harm, but it could be a lack of confidence in career.
What advice would you give to women starting out to kind of overcome that?
You have something to say, and you need to trust in your power to say it. And don't let anyone tell you that you can't say it. Let that block compel you. Let that drive you forward. And you find a mentor, write an irrefutable piece of evidence. Make it compelling. You can do that. If you've got something to say, you can base that in the scholarship and the research that needs to be done. And you can find those mentors who are going to help get you placed.
Do you think that change will come through women fighting for it, or for a recognition on men's part?
I think it has to be both. And I think we also have to recognize that gender doesn't just impact women. It may benefit men, but it only benefits really some men. It doesn't benefit all men. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out intersectional features, that gender intersects with race, it intersects with sexuality, it intersects with class, and that all of those identifiers can impede a person's progress.
Specifically in terms of gender and sexuality, how do you think those two interlink?
I think they're interdependent. I don't think we always recognize, I mean, gender is a social construction, but I would go with Butler that sexuality is also, the importance that we place on sexuality, the way that we perform sexuality is also, and so I think we need to recognize cis privilege, right, which is the privilege of heteronormativity, and I think we need to recognize how homophobic at times society still is. I think we've come a long way. I think we've come a tremendous way in the past 15 years. But I think I kind of place it at 15 years because that's where, like in the US, Ellen DeGeneres started her show and kind of she came out on her show. It became kind of a sea change. We began to see in television and pop culture more of an acceptance of homosexuality. And so I would say that created and prompted a bigger conversation. There was backlash in that conversation, but I think there's been a lot of forward momentum because of that conversation. But I do think we have still a considerable way to go.
What do you think we need to be doing to create that change?
I think we need to stop basing laws, rights, liberties off of identity. Those things are not linked to identity. They're linked to whether or not that person is a citizen. And we keep making politics about identity. So I was just teaching my counterterrorism class, and basically I think that the definition of terrorism has become wrapped up in identity instead of it's a method of violence. So if we're dealing with a method of violence, we're not dealing with the identity of a person. And yet UK counterterrorism through PREVENT documents is very focused on the Muslim community, not just the radical Islamic community, but on the Muslim community. Terrorism and counterterrorism should not be identity-based.
Sadly, not everyone who works in the IR department of St Andrews is so progressive. Bob Lambert also lectures, and his past work as an undercover police officer has fallen largely into disrepute. Claire and Merrick have worked on bringing such undercover police officers to justice, having been spied on themselves by Mark Kennedy. These police officers posed as activists, and many began relationships with women so they could fit more easily into the group. These relationships were not consensual, as the women did not know the identity of those they thought they loved. One such survivor has stated that she feels raped by the state. And then what you're working on at the moment, your current project, trying to partly raise awareness of secret police, bring people to justice. You have obviously encountered very extreme cases of institutionalised sexism. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, we came to the undercover police thing through personal contact with who a man we knew as Mark Stern, police officer Mark Kennedy, who's a friend of mine for 7 years. And Mark we were finding out he had more and more relationships with women. Certainly he had 4 serious relationships in that time, one of which lasted for 6 years. We subsequently found out there were other smaller ones, there were one-offs or short-term relationships that he kept secret from people. So it seems that there was at least a dozen sexual partners he had in the activists that he spied on, and he was not unusual in this. Of the officers that we've uncovered details of, 13 out of the 14 had such relationships, most of them long-term ones. This appears to be strategy, and it's deeply sexist. It's using the social capital of those women who are already known and trusted within a group, and to kind of piggyback that for their own credibility. Because if you turn up in a group and you're going out with somebody who's already liked and trusted, everyone wants to like. So yeah, it's using those women as social capital to get themselves further into the group. There was a brief period where they didn't do it. There was an officer who spied on us, the one woman officer that we've uncovered details of, Lynn Watson, who always talked about a boyfriend that she had who lived elsewhere in the country. Rod Richardson, who was Mark Kennedy's predecessor, he talked about a girlfriend he had who lived in another part of the country. And for social occasions, these partners turned up, and both separate groups of people went, well, they could do much better than that. That partner looks like a copper, because it was clearly another officer playing the role for the night. And those officers managed to go through their deployment. Lynn Watson did have a one-night stand with somebody, but they managed to get through without anybody sort of suspecting them for not having relationships. Kennedy said in the press, we had to have all the sexual relationships with people. Activists are incredibly promiscuous, and if you don't have loads of relationships with people, you would stand out, and it would be really suspicious, which is not My experience, obviously there's a lot of people in committed monogamous relationships. There are people who don't have relationships. There's all kinds of people. It's a group of people with a similar political concern, that's all. So it's an excuse on his part for what he did to kind of ingratiate himself with the group, but also, perk of the job. It's something that they do just to take as a benefit for themselves. It's the sexual and psychological abuse of women. And given that almost all of these officers did that the managers who ran them had done it themselves in their day, this was a strategy. This is institutional sexism.
And also, women shouldn't feel like they're putting themselves in line for sexual harassment from the state because they want to be politically active. And the kind of groups that have been infiltrated and women have been used targets for sexual relationships like this include groups that are just doing leafleting and having meetings like London Greenpeace were at the time. It doesn't mean that you have to be doing something really heavy and really serious and criminal activity for you to be targeted. Some of the women who were targeted weren't activists, they were just being used for their social capital. And to feel like if you're entering a movement and being politically active, that you're opening yourself up for this kind of sexual abuse is really outrageous. It's unbelievable that particularly women are opening themselves up for that just because they have an opinion and because they want to see change on issues they care about. And we don't know how many undercover police are involved in the movements. We don't know who they are. And so anyone that you decide to form a relationship with, anyone could be undercover police.
If we presume that it is almost all of them, there's been around 150 officers have done this since the units were formed in 1968. Most of the officers we've uncovered have had multiple relationships, and these are officers who are trained to make people trust them. They're trained to gain the trust of people socially, politically, and they're applying those techniques to personal relationships, to romantic situations, and managing to sort of intuit what you would like them to be for you. And so the initial contact, the love letters that they sent to women read very, very similarly from one officer to the next. So if it wasn't training, then there was certainly an attitude that they had in common. And then there can be the person that you have dreamed of or didn't even know you dreamed of, and this sense of a life stretching out together in front and making plans for being forever. And then when they leave, they feign a breakdown. They say they're not coping very well. They get paranoid. They get jumpy. They've got to leave and move abroad to get their head together. And again, this just continues the abuse. Letters will be sent from South Africa or New Zealand or wherever they say they've gone to, saying, this is I'm doing all right, and one day maybe you can join me. And it strings out the psychological abuse. More than one of the women who's had relationships did actually go out to the country where the officer was meant to be, not realising the officer is of course back at Scotland Yard now. People have been out to, one went to South Africa, one went to New Zealand trying to find this person because they're really concerned. This is somebody who's the person you care about most in the world who is having a breakdown, and you fear for what they might do to themselves. And this is straight, and people have been left absolutely bereft and distraught, and then have had to kind of gradually figure out what might have happened and start hating themselves for suspecting the love of their life. But it starts to look like, maybe what if they weren't what they say they were, and it's left them socially isolated because the people saying they couldn't have been a police officer, they were with you for 5 years, that wouldn't happen in this country, that's Stasi stuff, and it's left them damaged in many, many ways. And certainly now the truth has come out when they have uncovered who the officers were, have been left unable to trust. The person you trusted with everything, the person you let deepest into you of anybody ever in your life, if your judgment was completely wrong, if they were the opposite of everything they said, if everything about them was a lie, they were only in your life as a paid agent to undermine the things that matter the most to you, you can be wrong about anything. And speaking to a number of these women, none of them are going to have properly trusting relationships anytime soon.
Spectrum is a podcast based in St Andrews, and this is quite a pertinent issue for us. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, in St Andrews you have Dr. Bob Lambert, who was an officer with the Special Demonstration Squad. In the 1980s, he infiltrated London Greenpeace and had 4 relationships with women there. 2 of them very deep, committed relationships. One of them he lived with her for 3 years and they had a child together. And he then abandoned his partner and child and left her to bring up their son alone. He then went on to run the unit and was in charge of other officers, and his methods were taken as the blueprint. The training was very much on a mentoring basis. There weren't proper courses or any accreditation. It was done on the job with this because it was such a secret unit. The Metropolitan Police, most Metropolitan Police officers didn't know about the existence of this unit. It was very secret, so very little oversight, and so incredible opportunity for abuse. And Lambert ran other officers who also had long-term relationships. I think one of those, Jim Boyling, had children with a woman that he was spying on. His methods became the modus operandi of the unit, and he is now teaching in IR at St Andrews, and he also has a position at London Metropolitan University teaching criminology. He's there with the people who are going to be dealing with the state's response to political groups and tomorrow's police managers, and he's training them, and he is not a fit role model. He is uniquely unqualified to be a role model for people who are going to have special powers over citizens.
And there's an indication that he encouraged other officers after his time to have similar relationships.
We know that there was a memo that he sent around advising other officers to use condoms when having relationships with their targets. We know that there's one other officer at least who, under his management, had a child with one of his targets. And it definitely appears that Robert Lambert's relationships with women, using that as a strategy to be able to get social cachet in groups, appears to be a strategy that has been used for other officers under his management, and it's grossly unprofessional, a gross abuse of women, and never acceptable under any circumstances. And those are the words of the police.
Some of the officers were already in relationships or were already married when they went in to do this work and started other relationships. What happened to those marriages afterwards?
It was a matter of policy that they sent in officers who already had a family. As we understand it, it was felt that they were less likely to lose themselves in the role. They were more likely to come back out. And Bob Lambert already had a wife and children when he went in and formed these other relationships and had another child. So Jackie, the woman he had a child with, was believing that it was her first child. She believed it was his too, not realising that there was a half-brother and a half-sister already out there that he had just spent the weekend with when he came to be with her through the labour of their child. As we understand it, the marriages of the deep swimmer officers, as they're called, the ones who really immersed themselves in the role for years, didn't survive after their deployment ended.
Okay, so this has caused the breakup of two relationships for every officer.
You can see that way, yes, the officers would then come out, and as we understand it, all of the deep swimmer officers got divorced afterwards. So they were
destroyed
put through the
mill.
Put through the mill as well. Yeah.
The collateral damage is not just the women who are the targets, but also the women who were married to those officers in the first place.
And you were saying about the health risks. I think was it to Bob Lambert's children, and he didn't.
Yeah, this is. It's something that some of the journalists have shied away from, actually, because obviously this is a really personal thing for Lambert, and most people aren't going to go through what he's been through with his children, and I understand why people are wary of kind of doing stuff that looks like making political capital out of someone's personal tragedy. So Lambert did Lambert's children with his wife both died as young adults from a genetic condition that's testable, treatable if caught. And Lambert didn't inform Jackie, his activist partner, about the risk to their son, and he just let them carry on out there. And even if you think that maybe he had to protect the undercover method or whatever, and so couldn't have sent a one-line postcard from anywhere in the world. Once he'd been caught and outed, that excuse evaporates. And I can't see why he didn't go running to her door and say, get our son tested. But he didn't. He left it. He issued an apology to the group that he spied on, an apology to Belinda Harvey, who he had a 18-month relationship with, He didn't mention Jackie or his son at all. He seemed to just hope that one wouldn't come up.
So he's only apologising things for when there's irrefutable evidence. He's not actually confessing to anything.
So yeah, 8 months after he was outed, his case was covered in the Daily Mail, where he was accused of firebombing Debenhams when he was part of an animal rights cell who were going for Debenham stores that sold fur. And there's certainly, it's a thing he's denied, but there is certainly a lot of evidence that he was responsible for burning a Debenhams. And Jackie came home and opened a newspaper and saw the accusation that he'd burned down the Debenhams with a picture of the man she knew as Bob Robinson from back in the day, father of her child who she hadn't seen in 20 odd years. And that's how she found out. And so she traced him and found him, and it was only then that he mentioned the genetic condition and that their son got tested. Their son could have died in that 8 months in the middle there, or at any time, and he just left him. And so that's an indicator to me of the character of the man today. That's how he's behaving in his tenure as a lecturer at St Andrews and at London Metropolitan University. He's just firefighting each revelation as it comes out. This is not somebody who is coming clean. This is not somebody who's contrite.
Okay. So would you both agree that this is institutional sexism?
This is clearly and unarguably institutional sexism. The unit was almost entirely made of men who were having heterosexual relationships on the job, psychologically and sexually abusing women, and this was done with such a repeated pattern that it's a strategy. This isn't officers just making it up on their initiative. This was part of the job as they did it.
This is an extreme case, but exploitation of gender stereotypes and relationships can be seen from student jobs to top professions.
Over summer, I worked at Boots, and I noticed this. There were two bathrooms where the lockers were. There was the male and female bathrooms, and the female bathroom had more lockers than the male bathroom, as if they're expecting to employ more female people. And indeed, the boss was male, but the rest of the workers were mostly female. And indeed, whenever he talked, he'd be like, "Ladies," and in the back rooms, there'd be all the posters about promotional products for that week, and it would say, "Come on, girls, get your selling on," or something like that. It would always be referring to more females. The males assuming that more females would want to work at Boots and that more females would work there, which says something about our attitude to the type of work that you do at Boots. It sells makeup, so women like to be pretty and like to care about their health, apparently. Perhaps it's an indictment on the industry, an indictment on Boots, or an indictment on people applying, but it seems so biased towards gender. But even though more women worked there, the boss was still male.
I work for the BBC, and I think it's a pretty good employer as far as gender equality is concerned. The channel controllers of BBC One and BBC Two, both women. The head of sport is a woman, which is interesting. But of course the corporation is still waiting for its first female Director General.
How do you think that gender stereotypes still manifest themselves in the workplace?